The charcoal in Jack's hand was an extension of his very soul, smudging and sweeping across the textured paper to capture the stoic grace of the Brooklyn Bridge at dusk. From his small, cluttered apartment overlooking a quieter street, he rendered the world in shades of gray and silver, finding beauty in the mundane rhythm of a city at peace. His sketchbooks were filled with laundry lines strung between brick buildings, children playing stickball in the fading light, and old men debating on park benches, a quiet chronicle of ordinary life. This was his sanctuary, a world built from line and shadow, far removed from the grim headlines that had begun to dominate the newspapers. That sanctuary shattered on a Sunday afternoon. The radio, usually a source of swing music and baseball scores, crackled with a voice strained by urgency, reporting an unthinkable attack on a place called Pearl Harbor. The news seeped into the room like a cold draught, chilling the very air. Jack's hand stilled. The dip, half-finished sketch of a fruit vendor's cart, suddenly feeling trivial, a relic from a vanished era. In the days that followed, a new energy gripped the city. A collective fury and resolve replaced the casual pace of life. Recruitment posters appeared on every lamppost, their bold lettering and stern Uncle Sam's a stark contrast to his delicate drawings. A deep, restless conflict began to churn within him. He watched his friends, mechanics and clerks, trade their work clothes for uniforms with a sense of grim purpose. What could he, an artist, possibly offer? His weapons were brushes and pencils. His battles were fought on canvases, not battlefields. The idea of trading his sketchbook for a rifle felt like a betrayal of his very identity. Yet the thought of staying safely behind while others fought felt like a deeper cowardice. He spent long hours walking the vibrant, noisy streets, his artist's eye now seeing a different city, one bracing for war, its people united by a cause greater than themselves. Patriotism, a warm and fervent tide, washed over his doubts. It was a simple, powerful feeling, this love for his country and the need to defend its peace, the very peace he had spent years sketching. He found himself standing before a recruiting station, its doors a portal to an unknown future. The line was long, filled with young men whose faces mirrored his own tangled web of determination and fear. When his turn came, he stated his name and occupation. The recruiting sergeant, a man with weary eyes and a firm jaw, simply nodded and stamped his papers. The decision was made. Walking home for the last time, the weight of his choice settled upon him. He packed a small bag, his fingers lingering on the leather cover of his newest sketchbook before tucking it inside. He took one last look at his studio, at the half-finished works and the familiar skyline beyond the window. He was no longer just an artist capturing life. He was a soldier stepping into the chaos meant to preserve it. A profound uncertainty about what his talents could truly accomplish in the coming storm warred with the fierce, unshakable certainty that he had to try. The rigid geometry of basic training was a world away from the flowing lines of Jack's former life. Days were a brutal symphony of shouted orders, grueling marches, and the relentless disassembly and reassembly of weapons, whose cold, mechanical logic felt alien to his creative mind. He moved through the drills with the other recruits, his artist's hands growing calloused and raw, his mind numbed by routine. He felt like a misfit, a splash of watercolor on a canvas of olive drab. Just as he had begun to resign himself to a war fought solely with a rifle, the predictable rhythm was broken. His name was called one afternoon, not during roll call, but from a clipboard held by a stern-faced corporal who did not belong to their training company. The order was simple, yet carried an air of unspoken gravity. Jack was to report to a specific Quonset hut on the far edge of the camp, immediately and alone. A cold knot of apprehension tightened in his stomach as he was marched away from his squad, the curious glances of his comrades burning into his back. This was not the standard procedure for a disciplinary issue or a reassignment. This felt different. The hut was unmarked, its interior dim and Spartan, smelling of stale coffee and floor wax. 2 officers sat behind a plain wooden table, their uniforms crisp, their eyes sharp and analytical. They were not the blustering drill instructors he was accustomed to. Their silence was more intimidating than any shout. Without preamble, they pushed a sheet of paper and a set of charcoal pencils toward him. The request was absurd in its simplicity. Sketch the room. For a fleeting moment, Jack was back in Brooklyn, the familiar weight of the charcoal a comforting anchor in a sea of uncertainty. His hand moved with its old, instinctive grace, his artist's eye capturing the play of light from a single bare bulb, the grain of the wooden table, the subtle shadows under the officers' chins. He rendered not just objects, but the atmosphere itself, the tension, the quiet intensity. The officers studied the finished sketch, their expressions unreadable. Then came more questions, not about his marksmanship or his knowledge of field tactics, but about color theory, perspective, and his experience with scale and design. They showed him photographs of military vehicles and asked how he would replicate them, not with steel and grease, but with paint and canvas. The purpose of this bizarre interview began to dawn on him, a strange and thrilling possibility taking root. They were assessing his art, not his soldiering. Finally, the older of the 2 officers leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. He spoke of a new kind of warfare, one waged not with bullets but with illusions. He described a special, highly classified unit, a ghost army, tasked with the grand-scale deception of the enemy. Their arsenal would consist of inflatable tanks, rubber trucks, elaborate sound effects, and fake radio traffic, all designed to create phantom divisions where none existed, to mislead enemy intelligence and draw fire away from real Allied forces. They needed artists, he explained. Men who could make the unbelievable look real, who could paint shadows and light onto rubber and make it pass for steel from 500 yards. A torrent of emotions crashed over Jack. Curiosity burned bright. This was a purpose. He had never dared imagine a way to wield his talent as a legitimate weapon. But it was chased by a cold, sharp fear. This was not the straightforward heroism of the infantry. It was a shadow war, a game of chess where the stakes were thousands of lives. To succeed would be to save those lives. To fail would mean discovery, and likely annihilation. The officer's gaze was steady, waiting. The choice was his. Jack thought of his sketches of a peaceful Brooklyn, of the friends who had enlisted with him, of the sheer, audacious strangeness of the proposal. He took a slow, deep breath, the scent of charcoal still on his fingers. He looked the officer in the eye and gave a single firm nod. He agreed to join the Ghost Army. The train ride to Tennessee was a journey into a different America, one of dense, rolling woodlands and humid air that clung to the skin. For Jack, it was a passage further from the world he knew, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks a monotonous soundtrack to his swirling thoughts. The cryptic words of the interviewing officers echoed in his mind: Ghost Army, inflatable tanks, sonic deception. They were phrases that belonged in a pulp magazine, not in the grim lexicon of a world at war.
When the train finally shuddered to a halt at a remote siding, and the name Camp Forest was called out, he shouldered his duffel bag and stepped onto the platform with a sense of stepping through a looking-glass.
The camp sprawled across the cleared land, a temporary city of khaki tents and low wooden barracks. But it was the atmosphere that struck him first. This was not the rigid parade ground discipline of his basic training camp. There was a palpable buzz of chaotic energy, a low hum of industry that felt more like a bustling artist's colony or an inventor's workshop than a military installation. Men moved with purpose, but their conversations were punctuated with bursts of laughter and animated gestures, their uniforms often smudged with paint or grease. He was directed to his assigned barracks, a long, draughty building that smelled of fresh pine and damp wool. Inside, the diversity of the occupants was immediately apparent. A lanky man with intense, focused eyes was meticulously assembling a complex wooden frame, his movements those of a master carpenter. In another corner, a fellow with ink-stained fingers was hunched over a drafting table. A detailed schematic of what looked like a massive speaker spread out before him. Across from Jack's bunk, a man with the weathered hands of a sculptor was kneading a block of gray clay, shaping it into a perfect miniature replica of a tank tread. These were his new comrades, not just soldiers but draftsmen, engineers, radio operators, and advertising illustrators. They were a collection of misfit talents, united by a secret and bizarre purpose. Introductions were made with a casual, knowing air. There was no basic training bravado here, only a shared curiosity about what each man could bring to this strange endeavor. They were the architects of illusion, and this barracks was their studio. Later that afternoon, a lieutenant gathered the new arrivals for an orientation tour. They were led past rows of standard-issue barracks and motor pools, but then the tour veered into a more secluded area of the camp, cordoned off with extra fencing and guards. The lieutenant pushed open the doors to a vast, hangar-like warehouse, and Jack's breath caught in his throat. The space was a surrealist's dream, a cavern filled with the ghostly, deflated forms of an army. Dozens of rubber tanks lay in crumpled heaps on the concrete floor, their olive-drab skins waiting for the breath of life from air compressors. Stacked high on shelves were hundreds of inflatable trucks, jeeps, and artillery pieces, all meticulously designed, but unnervingly weightless. Along the walls leaned stacks of painted canvases meant to mimic supply dumps and command tents. The air was thick with the smell of rubber and fresh paint. It was a stage set for the greatest performance of their lives, a grand theatrical production where the audience was the German High Command, and a missed cue could mean catastrophe. Walking among these silent rubber phantoms, Jack ran his hand over the cool, taut surface of an inflatable Sherman tank. It was a perfect replica in form, but it lacked the substance, the crushing weight of real war machinery. He felt the unconventional nature of their mission settled deep into his bones. This was not about direct confrontation. It was about wit, about artistry, about fooling the enemy's eyes and ears. He was no longer just a soldier who could draw. He was an artist whose canvas was the battlefield itself, and his paints were the shadows of a war that wasn't really there. The surreal landscape of the warehouse gave way to an even stranger theater of war the next morning. Jack found himself standing with a small group in a wooded clearing at the edge of the camp, where a different kind of magic was being practiced. Here, the weapons were not rubber tanks, but sound raw, manufactured noise designed to deceive. Massive speakers, housed in the backs of ordinary-looking trucks, stood silent and imposing. A lanky corporal with grease-smudged coveralls and an easy grin was wrestling with a spool of thick cable. This was Mike, the unit's sound technician, and he moved with the practiced calm of a man completely at home with his bizarre tools. Mike's demonstration began not with a bang, but with a low, guttural rumble that seemed to vibrate up from the earth itself. It was the sound of tank treads clanking and grinding, a noise Jack had heard on training grounds, but here it emanated from the speakers with unnerving authenticity. Then came the sharper reports of distant artillery, the whine of jeep engines starting up in chorus, and the muffled, overlapping shouts of what sounded like an entire company moving into position. The sound swelled and faded, layered with such precision that Jack could almost see the Phantom Division materializing in the misty Tennessee woods. He watched Mike's hands dance across a complex control panel, his fingers adjusting dials and switches with the delicate touch of a concert pianist, orchestrating a symphony of pure illusion. After the demonstration, Jack was paired with Mike to practice setting up a decoy sound post. They worked in tandem, their movements falling into a natural rhythm. Jack helped anchor the heavy speakers and string the cables through the underbrush, camouflaging them with netting and fallen branches, while Mike tested the connections. There was a quiet competence to the sound man that Jack admired, a focus that spoke of countless hours perfecting this strange craft. As they worked, Mike would point out subtle details, the importance of varying the engine sounds to mimic a real convoy's imperfections, the way certain frequencies carried farther in the damp evening air. It was a lesson in auditory artistry, a counterpart to Jack's visual deceptions. Later, as the sun dipped below the tree line, they practiced with the inflatables. Jack joined a team, tasked with erecting a full battalion of rubber tanks in a field. The process was both absurd and fascinating. With powerful air compressors roaring to life, the limp canvas forms began to swell, slowly taking on the formidable shapes of Shermans and Pattons. Once inflated, the real work began. Jack used brushes and airbrushes to add shadows, mud spatters, and the subtle gleam of sunlight on fake metal. He painted tread marks in the soft earth leading to the decoys, creating a narrative of arrival and activity. It was meticulous, painstaking work, a far cry from the grand, expressive strokes of his Brooklyn sketches. Yet it required the same fundamental understanding of light, form, and perspective. Standing back to survey their handiwork as dusk settled, Jack was struck by the profound absurdity of it all. Here he was, an artist who had once sought to capture truth and beauty, now using every trick of his trade to create a magnificent, dangerous lie. The line of tanks, silhouetted against the twilight, looked utterly convincing from a distance, a formidable armored force ready for battle. Yet he knew they were nothing more than painted rubber, empty shells that would pop at the first touch of shrapnel. The innovation was breathtaking, a testament to human ingenuity turning the tools of art and theater into instruments of war. It was a bizarre alchemy, transforming brushes and speakers into weapons as potent as any rifle, proving that in this new kind of war, the most powerful army might just be the one that didn't exist at all. The days at Camp Forest settled into a rhythm of strange and meticulous creation. Jack's world narrowed to the bristle of a brush and the faint smell of oil-based paint, his hands constantly stained with the earthy tones of military green, dull brown, and gunmetal gray. His assigned workspace was a corner of the vast warehouse, surrounded by the slumped, ghostly forms of deflated tanks and trucks waiting for their transformation. His task was simple in description but complex in execution. To breathe visual life into these rubber shells, to trick the discerning eye of an enemy reconnaissance pilot flying hundreds of feet above. He began with the larger inflatable tanks, working from photographs and technical manuals to replicate every hinge, every bolt, every weld seam. He started with a base coat, then layered on shadows with a careful diluted black painting in the deep recesses under the turret, and along the bogie wheels to create the illusion of depth and solidity. With a finer brush, he added highlights along the edges of the fenders and the gun barrel, mimicking the way real metal caught the sun. The most crucial detail was the weathering. He spattered thin, muddy brown paint along the lower hull and flicked it up behind the treads. He used a nearly dry brush to create the subtle, streaked effect of rain and grime, the accumulated filth of a vehicle that had seen real combat. It was a form of hyper-realistic trompe-l'oeil, where every painted shadow was a defense against discovery, every fake mud splatter a potential life saved. While Jack and the other visual artists worked in near silence, their concentration a tangible force in the warehouse, a different kind of creation was happening outside. Through the open doors, he could hear the sound team, led by Mike, testing their own deceptions. The air would periodically thrum with the deep, chugging idle of a tank engine, or crackle with the static-laced chatter of a fake radio transmission. It was a symphony of fabrication, a chorus of lies composed to accompany the visual illusion he was painting. He found a strange comfort in the duality of their work, his silent, static deceptions given movement and life by their audible counterparts. One afternoon, an older sergeant named Miller, a man with a network of fine lines around his eyes, and the calm demeanor of someone who had seen too much, paused by Jack's workstation.
He watched in silence for a long moment as Jack meticulously stippled paint to simulate the textured surface of cast armor. When Jack finally looked up, the sergeant gave a slow, appreciative nod.
He didn't offer praise for the technique. Instead, he shared a story. He spoke of North Africa, of a small, desperate unit pinned down by German artillery, a handful of men with inflatable tanks, and a single sound truck had created the illusion of an entire armored regiment moving to flank the enemy position.
The German guns had shifted, turning away from the real soldiers to bombard the empty desert where the phantom tanks stood. The sergeant's voice was low and steady, his eyes fixed on a memory only he could see. He wasn't the only one. Over the following days, other veterans of earlier, smaller-scale deceptions would occasionally stop by, drawn by the focused artistry.
They shared fragments of their experiences, a fake airfield in Sicily that drew a bombing raid away from a real one, a phantom troop build-up in Italy that froze an entire German division in place. The stories were never told with bravado, but with a quiet, sober reverence.
They were not tales of glory, but of consequence. Each painted shadow on Jack's rubber tank, each carefully rendered detail, was no longer just an artistic exercise. It was a thread in a larger, invisible shield.
The work, which had sometimes felt absurd or disconnected from the visceral reality of war, now carried a profound and sobering weight. A renewed sense of purpose settled deep within Jack, solid and sure. His brush was not just a tool for creating illusion. It was a weapon for preserving truth, for protecting the lives of men he would never meet. He dipped his brush back into the paint, his strokes now filled with a grim and vital determination. The mess hall at Camp Forest became a sanctuary of shared strangeness, a place where the day's accumulated absurdities were unpacked and examined over plates of bland stew and weak coffee. It was here, away from the warehouses filled with rubber armies and the fields echoing with phantom engine roars, that the men of the Ghost Army truly began to coalesce.
Jack found himself drawn to a particular table, a gathering spot for the unit's more creatively inclined members, where the conversation was a world away from standard military fare. Seated across from him was Henry, a sculptor from Chicago, whose large, powerful hands seemed more suited to wrestling with blocks of marble than the delicate inflatable rubber he now maintained.
His face was perpetually smudged with grease or clay, and he spoke in a low, rumbling baritone about the challenges of making a canvas tank look as heavy and imposing as its steel counterpart. He missed the solidity of stone, he confessed one evening, the satisfying heft of a mallet and chisel. Now his greatest enemy was a strong wind that could send his creations tumbling across a field like children's balloons. Next to Henry was David, a Broadway set designer whose pre-war life had been a whirlwind of glittering costumes and dramatic stage lighting. He was a slight man with expressive hands and an endless supply of anecdotes about temperamental actors and last-minute prop disasters. He saw their entire operation as the ultimate
Theatrical production, a show staged for the most critical and dangerous audience imaginable. He would dissect their decoy setups with a director's eye, critiquing the sightlines and the overall composition, ensuring the illusion held from every conceivable angle.
The front lines, he mused, were just a very poorly reviewed theater district. Laughter was a frequent guest at their table, a necessary release from the intense pressure of their work.
They joked about their bizarre job titles: Private First Class of Inflatable Artillery, Sergeant of Sonic Deception. They invented ridiculous backstories for their rubber tanks, giving them names and personalities.
Henry once spent an entire meal describing with deadpan seriousness the intricate and entirely fictional maintenance schedule for a canvas jeep's emotional well-being. David would dramatically lament the lack of a curtain call after a successful deception operation. Jack found himself smiling more than he had in weeks, the tight knot of anxiety in his chest loosening in the warmth of this shared gallows humor. But the levity always eventually ebbed, giving way to a more somber undercurrent. The jokes were a thin veneer over the profound gravity of their task. One night after a particularly grueling day spent perfecting the visual details for a fake supply dump, the conversation turned quiet. Henry stared into his coffee cup, his sculptor's brow furrowed. He spoke not of the art, but of the consequence. Every convincing shadow Jack painted, every authentic engine sound Mike broadcast, was a deliberate lie told to an enemy who would respond with very real shells and bullets. Their creativity was a weapon, a tool to mislead and divert, to draw fire onto empty fields. The success of their art would be measured not in applause, but in the silence of artillery batteries that had been tricked into targeting phantoms, and in the lives of the infantrymen who were spared because of it. In those quiet moments, weight of their shared secret settled over the table. They were not just artists and engineers playing a strange game. They were soldiers wielding brushes and speakers as their rifles, their canvas the battlefield itself. The bond forming between them was forged not in the heat of direct combat, but in the shared understanding of this unique and heavy responsibility. They were a band of brothers united by a collective unspoken vow to make their illusions so perfect, so utterly believable, that they would become, for a fleeting and critical moment, more powerful than the truth. The Tennessee summer had baked the red clay of Camp Forest hard, but a new, sharper tension now crackled in the humid air, cutting through the familiar rhythms of creation and rehearsal. It arrived not with a shout, but with a quiet official rustle of paper, a stack of orders delivered to the commanding officer's tent. The news spread through the unit, not as a roar, but as a swift, sobering whisper, passing from man to man in the warehouses, across the sound fields, and finally into the mess hall. The time for practice was over. The Ghost Army was shipping out. Europe awaited. A strange, electric stillness fell over the camp. The playful banter that usually filled the workshops vanished, replaced by the grim, efficient sounds of preparation. The vast, hangar-like space, once a surreal artist's studio, was transformed into a hive of disciplined activity. The whimsical, deflated forms of tanks and trucks were no longer practice subjects. They were now cargo, carefully inventoried, folded with a new kind of reverence, and packed into large, unmarked crates. Jack worked alongside Henry and David, their hands moving swiftly, rolling the painted canvas and rubber into tight, manageable bundles. The material felt different, now lighter somehow, yet freighted with an immense and terrifying potential. Each crated decoy was a promise, or a threat, of the chaos they were about to unleash upon the world. That evening, Jack found a quiet corner of the barracks, a small, personal island amidst the controlled chaos of packing. He pulled out a sheet of V-mail paper and a pencil, the familiar tools feeling alien in his hand. How did one write home about this? He could not describe the inflatable armies, the sonic deceptions, the secret purpose that now defined his every waking moment. The censor's black pen loomed large in his mind. He began to write, his words vague and stilted, a hollow echo of the turmoil inside him. Dear family, I hope this letter finds you well. The training has been rigorous and unlike anything I could have imagined. We are being sent overseas soon. I cannot say where, of course. Please, do not worry. I am in good company. He filled the page with such empty reassurances, painting a picture of a standard infantryman's experience, a bland and featureless lie to protect the magnificent, dangerous truth. He signed his name, sealed the envelope, and felt a profound distance open up between the man he was and the son they remembered. The following morning was a blur of final preparations. The crates of deceptive gear were loaded onto trucks under heavy guard, their mundane exteriors belying the surreal contents within. Alongside them went the massive speaker units, the spools of cable, the generators and the control panels, the sonic heart of their phantom army. Jack shouldered his own pack, heavy with his personal gear, and tucked safely at the bottom, his sketchbook. He looked around at his comrades. Mike was calmly checking the connections on the final speaker truck, his technician's focus a bastion of calm. Henry's face was set in a grim mask, his sculptor's eyes cataloging the scene as if memorizing it for a future monument. David, the set designer, surveyed the loading operation with a critical eye, ensuring the final act of their stateside performance was staged correctly. A potent mix of emotions churned within the unit, a cocktail of excitement, fear, and a deep, sobering apprehension. The theoretical was becoming real. The fields of Tennessee had been a safe stage. The battlefields of Europe would offer no such luxury. The excitement was the thrill of the artist finally approaching the grand canvas, of the actor stepping onto the world stage. The fear was a cold, sharp stone in the gut. The fear of the unknown, of failure, of the very real bullets and shells that sought out both real armies and fake ones with equal indifference. As the final truck was loaded and the order to move out was given, Jack took one last look at Camp Forest. It had been a strange and wonderful nursery for their illusions. Now, it was time to set their phantoms loose upon the war. The sea was a vast, shifting canvas of grays and greens, an endless expanse of restless energy that stretched to the horizon in every direction. From the crowded rail of the troop ship, Jack watched the churning wake foam and dissolve into the deep, a hypnotic spectacle of power and impermanence. The ship itself was a floating city of khaki and anxiety, a steel island bearing thousands of men, their collective breath held against the threat of U-boats lurking in the dark waters below. The air was thick with the smells of salt, diesel, and the close-pressed scent of human anticipation. Jack found the small, semi-secluded spot on the deck, his back against a bulkhead, and opened his sketchbook. The pencil in his hand felt like an anchor, a tether to the self he had been before the world had tilted onto a war footing. He began to draw the ocean, not as a flat plane, but as a living, breathing entity. He captured the way the light fractured on the crests of the swells, the deep, impenetrable shadows in the troughs, the sheer, daunting scale of it all. It was a challenge to his skill, to render the fluid, ever-changing surface with static lines. His gaze then lifted from the water to the men around him. He sketched them quickly, capturing the 4 unguarded moments that revealed the weight they all carried. He drew a young soldier leaning over the rail, his face pale and contemplative as he stared into the abyss. He drew a group playing cards on an upturned crate, their laughter a brittle sound against the constant wind. He drew the weary, resolute set of a sergeant's shoulders as he scanned the horizon, his eyes older than his years. In these quick, gestural lines, Jack documented the human cargo of this great steel vessel, a gallery of quiet courage and concealed fear. As his pencil moved, his mind drifted from the present sketches to the ones he might be forced to draw in the future. The playful deceptions of Camp Forest now felt like a distant dream, a dress rehearsal for a performance where the stakes were final. He thought of the carefully crated inflatable tanks in the ship's hold, the deflated rubber shells that held the potential to divert entire enemy divisions. He thought of Mike's complex sound equipment, packed away to broadcast the ghostly noises of an army that was not there. Would it work? Could their art, their clever illusions, truly hold against the brutal, grinding reality of war? The pencil felt suddenly fragile in his hand. What power did a sketch or a painted shadow on a rubber tank truly have against the monolithic force of the German war machine? The weight of their mission settled upon him not as a patriotic duty, but as a profound and terrifying responsibility. They were sailing into the heart of the conflict, armed with little more than imagination and a desperate hope that it would be enough. The days blurred into one another, marked by the clanging of the ship's bell and the shifting light on the water. Drills broke the monotony, sending men scrambling to lifeboat stations, a grim reminder of the ever-present danger beneath the waves. At night, a strict blackout plunged the ship into an eerie darkness, the world reduced to the sound of the engines and the sigh of the sea. Jack would lie in his bunk, the sketchbook under his pillow, and listen to the breathing of the men around him. each one was a story, a life hurtling toward an unknown chapter. He was one of them, yet set apart by his secret purpose. He was an artist, sailing into a war of steel, tasked with fighting it with whispers and shadows. The vast, indifferent ocean seemed to swallow their tiny ship, a reminder of their insignificance in the grand scheme of things. Yet, within their insignificant vessel, they carried a secret that could, if their artistry held, alter the course of battles and save countless lives. It was a fragile hope, a small, defiant light in the immense and overwhelming dark. The first sight of France was not the romantic coastline from postcards or the bustling ports of his imagination, but a bruised and broken landscape, a world stripped raw by the machinery of war. The troop ship, having navigated the ghostly, wreck-strewn waters of the English Channel, finally dropped anchor off the coast of Normandy. A cold, damp wind carried the scent of salt, smoke, and something darker, a metallic tang of rust and spent explosives that clung to the back of the throat. Before them, the beaches of the D-Day landings lay exposed, their names Omaha, Utah now etched into history with blood and fire. Jack stood at the rail, his knuckles white as he gripped the cold metal, his artist's eye struggling to process the scene of monumental destruction. The horizon was a jagged line of shattered trees and skeletal buildings, their forms stark against a gray, weeping sky. The sand itself was churned into a chaotic morass of crater holes, tangled metal, and the discarded debris of battle helmets, ration tins and torn pieces of canvas that fluttered like forlorn flags. Wrecked landing craft lay beached and gutted, their hulls ripped open to reveal their empty, rusting innards. Further inland, the blackened husks of tanks and trucks dotted the fields, silent monuments to the ferocity of the fighting that had taken place just weeks before. It was a canvas of ruin, painted in shades of mud, ash, and oxidized steel, a brutal masterpiece of devastation that no artist could ever conceive. Disembarkation was a slow, grim process, a cautious descent into a world where every sense was assaulted. The gentle rocking of the ship was replaced by the unstable, sucking grip of the wet sand under his boots. The air, which had been clean and sharp at sea, was now thick with the pervasive smell of damp earth, cordite, and the faint, sickly sweet odor of decay that no amount of cleanup could fully erase. The sounds were a discordant symphony of grinding truck engines, distant, sporadic hammering, and the low, constant murmur of thousands of men moving with a weary purpose. They filed past engineers still clearing lanes through minefields, their faces smeared with grime, their movements deliberate and tired. They were loaded onto trucks, their own crates of deceptive gear, following on separate vehicles under a heavier guard. The convoy began its slow, lurching journey away from the coast, moving inland along roads that were little more than muddy tracks churned to soup by countless tires and tank treads. They passed through villages that were no more than piles of rubble, the splintered remains of homes where life had been violently erased. In the midst of this desolation, they saw the real soldiers of the war. Men with hollow eyes and uniforms caked in mud sat by the roadside, smoking in silence or staring into the middle distance with a profound exhaustion that seemed to have seeped into their very bones. These were not the triumphant liberators of propaganda posters. They were weary, hardened men who had stared into the abyss and carried its shadow with them. Watching them, the reality of the war finally, irrevocably, crashed down upon Jack. The theoretical discussions at Camp Forest, the clever deceptions and artistic challenges, All of it felt like a childish game in the face of this raw, unvarnished truth. This was not a stage set, it was a charnel house. The inflatable tanks in their crates felt absurdly, terrifyingly fragile. How could their painted shadows and recorded sounds possibly stand up to the crushing, tangible reality of this destruction? The weight of their mission, which had felt like a heavy responsibility during the Atlantic crossing, now felt like an impossible burden. He was an artist in a world that had run out of beauty, a forger of illusions entering a realm of brutal, unyielding fact. As the truck jolted onward, carrying him deeper into the heart of the war-torn countryside, he knew that the time for rehearsal was over. Their phantoms were about to be tested in a theater, where the price of a failed illusion was measured in blood. The night was a shroud of wet wool, and silence broken only by the squelch of boots in thick mud, and the low, tense whispers of men moving like ghosts through the French countryside. They had arrived at their designated position under the cover of a moonless sky, a stretch of field near the front lines that was to become the birthplace of their first great illusion. The air was cold and carried the distant, sporadic thump of artillery, a grim reminder that the real war was close, a sleeping beast just over the next ridge. For Jack, the abstract concepts of Camp Forest, the theory of deception, the practice of painting shadows were about to be tested in the crucible of reality. The work began with a frantic, hushed urgency. From the backs of the trucks, they unloaded the heavy, canvas-wrapped bundles that contained their phantom army. Powerful, muffled air compressors coughed to life, their chugging a nervous heartbeat in the dark. Jack worked with a team on the visual decoys, their movements a well-rehearsed ballet of unfolding and anchoring. One by one, the limp forms were laid out on the damp earth. As the compressors forced air into them, the rubber and canvas began to stir, to swell, rising from the ground like strange, bloated mushrooms. Slowly, they took shape, the hulking, unmistakable silhouettes of Sherman tanks, the slender profiles of anti-aircraft guns, the bulky forms of supply trucks. In the deep gloom, they were spectral, half-formed giants, waiting for the artist's touch to grant them the illusion of substance. As the first hint of dawn tinged the eastern sky with a pale, sickly gray, Jack's real work began. He moved among the inflated forms with his kit of brushes and paints, his breath pluming in the frigid air. This was not the careful, measured work of the Tennessee warehouse. This was a race against the encroaching light. He used broad, swift strokes to darken the undersides of the turrets and hulls, creating the deep shadows that would suggest solid mass from a distance. He flicked a mixture of mud and water from a stiff bristled brush to spatter the lower halves, simulating the grime of movement. His eyes, trained for years to see the subtle interplay of light and form, now worked to deceive that very sense. Every stroke was a lie told to the sky, a plea to the lenses of German reconnaissance cameras to see steel where there was only air and painted canvas. While Jack and the visual team labored in near silence, a different kind of creation was unfolding 100 yards away. Mike and the sound engineers were setting up their own deception. The massive speakers, carefully positioned to throw their sonic illusion across a wide arc, were connected by a spiderweb of cables to the control truck. A test run began, not with a roar, but with a low, guttural murmur, the sound of a tank column idling, the clank of a track being adjusted, the muffled, indistinct voices of a crew. The sounds were unnervingly authentic, a perfect auditory backdrop to the visual scene. Jack was painting. It was the ghost of an army stirring to life, its heartbeat a recorded loop, its breath the hiss of compressed air, the tension mounted with the sun. The field, which had been an empty stretch of land hours before, now appeared to host a fully equipped armored battalion at rest. The inflatables stood in convincing formation, their painted details holding up in the soft morning light. The sound of engines revving and orders being barked through speakers created a palpable sense of activity. Then the sound they had all been dreading and expecting cut through the manufactured din, the high, thin whine of an aircraft engine. A German Feisler Storch, a tiny reconnaissance plane, appeared as a speck in the vast, lightning sky. It banked lazily, a vulture circling its prey. Every man on the ground froze, their hearts hammering against their ribs. Jack stood beside his painted tank, his brush still in his hand, watching the plane make its slow, deliberate pass. The success of their mission, the validity of their entire strange purpose, now rested on the fragile, painted skin of a rubber phantom, and the believability of a recorded sound. The plane completed its circle and droned off toward the German lines, carrying with it a photograph of a division that did not exist. The silence it left behind was heavier than any sound. The silence after the reconnaissance plane's drone faded was a physical weight, pressing down on the men hidden among the trees and hedgerows. Minutes stretched into an agonizing hour, each man holding his breath, waiting for the response their deception was meant to provoke. Then it came, not with the localized, probing fire they might have expected, but with a distant, thunderous roar from the north, a sustained barrage of artillery that shook the very ground beneath their feet. The German batteries, convinced by the Phantom Division in their midst, had redirected their fury. Shells that were meant for a real Allied concentration, miles away, were now raining down on empty fields, churning earth and air where no soldier stood. The distant, rolling thunder was the sound of their success, a symphony of wasted enemy ammunition, orchestrated by their painted lies and recorded sounds. A quiet, disbelieving celebration rippled through the unit. There were no shouts, no backslaps, only a series of slow, relieved exhalations and the shared, knowing looks of men who had just pulled off the impossible. Mike emerged from the sound truck, wiping grease from his hands with a rag, a slow grin spreading across his tired face. Henry the sculptor clapped a massive paint-stained hand on Jack's shoulder. The gesture, saying more than words ever could, they had done it. They had woven a tapestry of light and sound so convincing it had bent the will of the enemy, diverting forces and firepower based on an intelligence report of an army made of little more than air and imagination. The relief was a palpable warmth. Cutting through the morning's chill, they packed their gear with a new, confident efficiency, the inflatable tanks hissing into limp, harmless piles of canvas as the air was sucked from them, their duty done. But for Jack, the euphoria was a fleeting visitor, chased away by a cold, creeping unease. As he carefully folded the painted tank skin he had labored over, his fingers traced the fake shadows and manufactured mud. In the grey light of the French morning, the artistry looked cheap, a shoddy forgery. He thought of the German gunners, men he would never see, loading shells and firing them at this empty field on his account. He thought of the distant crumps of the explosions,
the sheer destructive power that had been pointlessly unleashed because of his brushstrokes.
Was this a victory? He had used his talent, the very thing that had always been his means of seeking truth and beauty, to craft a perfect, weaponized lie. The success of their illusion felt less like a triumph and more like a corruption. He had not saved a life directly. He had merely redirected death elsewhere, making himself accomplice in a larger, more abstract violence. The team moved out as quietly as they had arrived, leaving the field as empty as they had found it, the only evidence of their presence the faint, geometric impressions in the mud where the phantoms had stood. As their truck bounced along the rutted track away from the front, Jack stared out at the passing landscape, the shattered farms, the splintered woods, the grim-faced real soldiers marching in the other direction. His comrades chatted in low, relieved tones around him, but their voices felt distant.
He was an artist who had painted a target on a piece of empty land and watched the enemy oblige by trying to destroy it. The moral landscape of his war had just become impossibly complex.
He had proven that his art could be a powerful weapon, but in that moment, holding the proof of its efficacy, he felt only the profound and unsettling weight of the illusions they were destined to create. The low, guttural growl of a panzer division did not rumble from the east, but emanated from a line of unassuming trucks parked in a French orchard, their massive speakers aimed at the distant German lines like the barrels of some new sonic artillery. This was Mike's domain, a theater of sound where the weapons were oscillators, amplifiers, and carefully curated recordings on fragile glass discs. Jack watched from the periphery, his own work with the visual decoys complete for the moment. As the sound team prepared for their nightly performance, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and apple blossoms, a pastoral setting for a most unnatural creation. Mike moved with a quiet intensity, his hands, usually stained with grease, now delicately adjusting dials on the control panel inside the lead truck. His face was a mask of concentration, his ears attuned to frequencies and amplitudes that were as real to him as color was to Jack. The performance began not with a crescendo, but with a building murmur. First, the distinctive clatter of tank treads on cobblestones, recording captured from their own armored units and now played back with subtle variations in speed and volume to mimic the imperfection of a real convoy. Then, the deeper-throated idle of heavy diesel engines, layered with the shouted indistinct commands of officers and the metallic clang of hatches being secured. It was not a single sound, but a complex moving tapestry of noise designed to suggest the massing of an entire armored regiment just behind the tree line. Mike orchestrated it all, fading one track in as another faded out, creating the illusion of movement, of vehicles maneuvering into position for a dawn assault. To any German listening post across the valley, it would be unmistakable. The Americans were preparing for a major push. Jack's role was to provide the silent partner to this auditory deception. While the sounds of war echoed through the night, he and his team were deploying the complementary visual decoys half-mile away, in a field, strategically chosen to align with the sonic narrative. They inflated a new batch of rubber Shermans, and Jack worked swiftly under the faint starlight, using broad impressionistic strokes to paint the necessary shadows and grime. He didn't need perfection here, he needed suggestion. The sounds created the expectation in the enemy's mind, and his painted forms merely confirmed what they already believed they were hearing. He painted not what was there, but what the sounds insisted must be there. It was a collaborative lie, a duet between the seen and the unseen. Later, during a lull while the sound loops reset, Mike joined Jack at the edge of the decoy field. The two men stood in the darkness, listening to the manufactured war and looking at the painted phantoms. Mike wiped a hand across his forehead, his earlier intensity giving way to a thoughtful exhaustion. He gestured toward the speakers, then toward Jack's tanks. He spoke not of warfare, but of craft. He explained how the most believable deception was a marriage of disciplines. The sound alone could be dismissed as a recording, a trick. The visual decoys alone could be revealed as hollow by a stray shell or a curious patrol. But when the ear reported the rumble of tanks and the eye, even from a distance, confirmed their presence, the illusion became unshakable truth in the mind of the observer. It was the synthesis of their two arts that created a reality more powerful than the facts. Jack understood the moral unease from their first operation, momentarily quieted by the sheer elegance of the concept. His paintings gave the sounds a body. Mike's sounds gave his paintings a soul. They were not just creating a fake army. They were creating a believable story, a narrative of threat and movement that the enemy intelligence apparatus would dutifully report and their commanders would act upon. In the darkness of that French orchard, surrounded by the ghosts of their own making, the line between art and warfare dissolved completely. Were no longer just soldiers who painted or technicians who played records. They were storytellers, and the battlefield was their page, their grand, terrible, and utterly convincing fiction, written in light and sound. The illusion had held for 3 days, a perfect painted lie that had drawn sporadic German artillery fire and fixed the attention of an entire enemy reconnaissance battalion. But perfection in war is a fleeting mirage, shattered by the unpredictable chaos of the front. It began with the frantic, whispered report from a lookout posted in a shell-blasted church tower, a German patrol, not the distant observers they were accustomed to deceiving, but a squad of grim-faced infantrymen was moving through the hedgerows, advancing directly toward their position. They were not looking at the sky for planes. They were scanning the ground, and they were getting dangerously close to discovering that the formidable armored division in that path was nothing but painted rubber and amplified noise. The order to evacuate crackled over the field telephones, a hissed command that sent a jolt of pure, cold adrenaline through every man. There was no time for the careful, methodical packing of Camp Forest. This was a frantic, desperate scramble. The air compressors were killed, their chugging silence suddenly deafening. The powerful speakers fell mute mid-roar, cutting off the phantom convoy in an unnerving instant. Men worked with a frantic, silent urgency, wrestling with the suddenly cumbersome inflatables. The hiss of escaping air was a terrifying sound, the death rattle of their illusions as tanks and trucks sagged into wrinkled, lifeless heaps. They were not packing for reuse. They were trying to erase all evidence of their presence before the enemy stumbled upon them. Jack's training took over, a calm focus, descending through the panic. While others deflated and bundled, his artist's eyes scanned the scene. The geometric impressions in the mud, the scattered tracks from their own trucks, the two perfect lines of their setup. It was a crime scene of deception waiting to be read by the approaching patrol. He grabbed a bundle of camouflage netting and a bucket of mud and ash he kept for weathering. He didn't try to hide the deflated equipment. That was impossible. Instead, he worked to disguise the fact that they had ever been there at all. He and a few others dragged the netting over the flattened tank shapes, kicking leaves and broken branches over the top. He used his hands to smear the mud mixture over the tire tracks leading into the field, blending them into the general churn of the earth. He scattered debris randomly, destroying the orderly pattern that betrayed human activity. It was not about creating a new illusion, but about restoring a natural one, painting over their own presence with the colors of neglect and emptiness. They had just thrown the last of the crated equipment into the trucks when the first helmeted figure appeared at the far end of the field, cautiously peering through the hedgerow. The engines turned over with a roar that felt obscenely loud, and the convoy lurched into motion, bouncing across the field toward a narrow track at the rear. Jack, clinging to the side of a truck, watched over his shoulder as the German patrol emerged fully into the field they had just vacated. The soldiers moved slowly, rifles at the ready, their eyes scanning the trampled ground and the oddly placed clumps of netting and branches. One of them kicked at the edge of a net, revealing a crumpled corner of olive-drab rubber beneath. He bent down, examining it, then looked up, his gaze sweeping the retreating trucks. For a heart-stopping moment, his eyes seemed to lock with Jack's across the distance. Then, with a dismissive shrug, he straightened up and waved his squad forward. They had seen nothing of consequence, just a muddy, abandoned field, a place where no army had ever been. The trucks did not stop until they were miles behind the new front lines. The immediate danger passed. The men sat in a stunned, exhausted silence, the adrenaline crash leaving them hollow and shaking. They had escaped by a thread, a margin measured in seconds, and the quality of Jack's hasty camouflage work. The commanding officer moved through the group, his face grim. There were no words of congratulation, only a quiet acknowledgement of their narrow escape and a sober reminder. The danger was not abstract. It was not just about the success of their deceptions, but about their own survival. The enemy was not a faceless, distant intelligence apparatus. They were men with rifles who could walk into their field and expose the grand illusion for the fragile artifice it was. The importance of their role was now underscored not by a distant artillery barrage, but by the cold, sharp fear of a near discovery. Their art was a shield, but it was a shield that could be shattered in an instant, leaving them exposed and defenseless in the very heart of the war they sought to manipulate. The art of making something real disappear was a far more demanding discipline than creating a convincing fake. In the deceptive world of the Ghost Army, Jack had grown accustomed to giving form to phantoms, but this new task required the opposite erasing substance, making solid steel melt into the landscape. The assignment came down at dawn. A battery of real 105 mm howitzers, crucial to the upcoming Allied offensive, needed to be hidden in a small, exposed orchard, directly in the line of suspected German aerial reconnaissance. Failure was not an option. The discovery of these guns would bring down a storm of steel that would obliterate them and compromise the entire operation. The guns were already in position, their long, menacing barrels pointed toward the enemy lines, their green paint stark against the muted colors of the French countryside. Jack stood before them, not with the playful creativity he used on the inflatables, but with the sober focus of a surgeon. His tools were different here, heavy rolls of fishnet-style camouflage netting, buckets of local mud, clay, and crushed vegetation, and a collection of sprayers and larger brushes. His canvas was not rubber, but cold, hard steel, and his goal was not to create an illusion of presence, but an illusion of absence. He worked with a small team, their movements synchronized and efficient. They began by draping the netting over the guns and their prime movers, securing it so that it hung in irregular, natural-looking folds, not the taut, geometric shapes that would catch a pilot's eye. This was just the skeleton of the deception. The real artistry came next. Jack mixed the local earth with water to create a thick, viscous paste. He climbed onto the gun shields and the hoods of the trucks, using a large brush to slather the mud onto the netting, not as a uniform coat, but in random textured patches, breaking up the man-made patterns. He then took handfuls of crushed grass, wilted leaves, and small broken branches and pressed them into the wet mud. He studied the surrounding trees, noting the specific shades of green and brown, and replicated them with deft flicks of his sprayer, blending the edges of the netting seamlessly into the grass and the dappled shadow beneath the apple trees. It was painstaking physical work, the mud caking under his fingernails and the smell of damp earth filling his nostrils. As he worked, his mind drifted back to his Brooklyn studio, to the peaceful afternoon spent trying to capture the exact way light fell through a window onto a bowl of fruit. He had been obsessed with rendering reality then, with understanding the physics of shadow and the poetry of color. Now he was using that very same knowledge to subvert reality, to bend light and shadow to his will in order to hide it. The connection was direct and profound, the careful observation of how a leaf cast a shadow, or how a patch of dirt changed color when wet. All those seemingly trivial artistic lessons were now being deployed to protect the lives of the gun crew who watched him work with quiet, hopeful eyes. By late afternoon, the transformation was complete. Where there had been a clear, deadly military installation, there was now only what appeared to be a slightly overgrown, uneven patch of orchard. From even a few 100 feet away, the guns were invisible, swallowed by the land itself. A profound sense of fulfillment, different from anything he had felt before, settled over him. Tainting the inflatables was an intellectual victory, a clever trick played on a distant enemy. This was something more visceral, more immediate. His art was not just a weapon of deception here. It was a literal cloak, a shield of paint and netting that stood between these men and death. He had used his talent not to create a phantom, but to protect a truth. As he cleaned his brushes in a bucket of murky water, he looked at his mud-stained hands, no longer the clean hands of a studio artist, but the stained, capable hands of a soldier whose unique and strange art had for one day directly and unquestionably saved lives. The moon was a sliver of bone in a sky choked with cloud, offering just enough diluted light to navigate by but not enough to be seen. In this profound darkness, the war changed its character. The distant artillery duels became muffled, the world reduced to the scuff of a boot, the rustle of canvas, and the shallow, controlled rhythm of his own breathing. This was Jack's new studio, a stretch of field somewhere in France. His easel the cold, damp earth, his subject a fleet of spectral inflatable tanks that lay like beached sea creatures waiting for his touch. By day, his work was about hiding reality. By night, it was about conjuring a believable fiction from nothing but air and paint. He worked by the faint, hooded glow of a blue-filtered lantern, a tiny island of light in an ocean of black. The inflatable Sherman before him was a pale, featureless ghost, a blank slate upon which he had to paint the gritty, undeniable truth of a war machine. He dipped his brush into a can of thinned matte black paint, his movements slow and deliberate, his artist's senses heightened in the near-total darkness. He painted not what he saw, but what he knew must be there. His brush traced the deep, black void beneath the turret, the shadowed recesses of the bogey wheels, the long dark streak that would suggest the grime of exhaust along the hull. Each stroke was a calculated lie, a piece of visual information designed to fool the human eye and the camera lens from 500 yards. He was writing a story in shadow and grime, a narrative of use and wear that would whisper real to anyone who looked upon it in the dawn's light. As his hands performed their familiar, meticulous work, his mind wrestled with a deeper, more troubling canvas. He thought of the masters he had studied in museums, Rembrandt's profound humanity, Turner's sublime light, the raw truth of the Ashcan school. They had used their art to reveal, to illuminate, to connect humanity to its own experience. And here he was, in a muddy field in France, using every technical skill he had learned from them to do the exact opposite. His art was not a window to truth, but a door to a carefully constructed lie. He was a forger, not of old masters, but of military reality. The ethics of it coiled like a cold snake in his gut. Was this a corruption of his gift? A betrayal of the very purpose of art? Or was it, in this brutal context, its highest and most necessary calling? The paint on his brush felt heavy with the weight of the paradox. He was not alone in his nocturnal labors. A few yards away, another artist, a printmaker from Boston named Leo, was working on a dummy artillery piece. Leo was a quiet man, older than most, with the patient, precise hands of someone who had spent a lifetime carving fine lines into woodblocks. Under the weak blue light, his face was a mask of concentration, his movements as steady and sure as they must have been in his clean, ink-scented studio back home. After a long stretch of silence, Leo spoke, his voice a low murmur that barely disturbed the night. He didn't speak of the war or of tactics, but of the strange alchemy of their situation. He talked about the fundamental human urge to create, to impose order and meaning on chaos. In Boston, that meant carving a scene of a bustling harbor. Here, in France, it meant painting shadows on a rubber tank to create the illusion of order for an enemy, to impose a false meaning on the chaos of the battlefield that would, in turn, save lives. It was a simple observation, but it landed on Jack with the force of revelation. He looked from Leo's calm, focused face to the emerging form of the tank under his own hands. This was not a perversion of their creativity. It was an adaptation, a desperate and brilliant evolution. Their art had not abandoned its purpose. Its purpose had been redefined by the extreme circumstances of survival. The blend was not one of corruption, but of necessity. The same eye for composition that arranged a still life was now arranging a decoy battalion. The same understanding of light that gave a portrait its life was now giving a phantom tank its convincing solidity. They were using the fundamental tools of human expression not for beauty or truth in the abstract, but for the most visceral, immediate truth of all, the preservation of life. The creative impulse and the will to survive had become one and the same, fused in the cool, damp air of the French night, their brushes moving not in the service of art for art's sake, but in the solemn, vital service of the men who fought the real war just over the hill. The summons came not with the blare of a trumpet or the bark of a sergeant, but as a quiet, insistent ripple moving through the unit, a current of unspoken gravity that pulled them from their scattered tasks and gathered them in the dim, cavernous interior of a requisition barn. The air, thick with the smells of old hay, damp earth, and the faint, sharp scent of ozone from their recently tested radio equipment, grew heavy with anticipation. They stood in a loose semicircle, these artists and engineers of deception, their faces illuminated by the single bare bulb hanging from a beam, its light casting deep shadows that danced with the movement of moths. The comfortable, practiced rhythm of their work, the painting, the inflating, the sound checks was suddenly suspended, replaced by the taut silence of men waiting for a verdict on their past performances and a directive for their future. Two men from G2, the intelligence section, stood before them. They were not frontline officers. Their war was waged with maps and intercepted messages, their uniforms clean, their eyes possessing a cool, analytical sharpness that missed nothing. Senior officer, a colonel with a neatly trimmed mustache, and a gaze that seemed to look through them rather than at them, unrolled a large situation map on a makeshift table of crates. The colored lines and unit symbols were a cryptic language of impending conflict, but the colonel's pointer tap landed not on a concentration of Allied force, but on a quiet sector of the front, an area the Ghost Army had recently vacated. He confirmed what they had already suspected from the diverted artillery fire. Their Phantom division had been a success. The Germans had taken the bait, their reconnaissance reports speaking of a significant armored buildup, where none existed. But success, the colonel explained in a calm, measured tone, was a double-edged sword. The enemy was not stupid. They were methodical and suspicious. Their intelligence apparatus, though fooled, was now actively questioning the discrepancies, the ghostly appearances and disappearances of Allied units that defied normal logistical patterns. German commanders were growing wary, their instincts prickling at the edges of the grand illusion the Ghost Army was weaving. The pointed tip of the colonel's pointer then swept across the map to a different region, a wooded area near the German border. Here, the real Allied spearhead was massing for a critical offensive, a thrust designed to break the enemy's spine. Its success depended entirely on surprise, on the Germans believing the main threat was elsewhere. This was the genesis of Operation Bettendorf. The colonel's voice remained level, but the weight behind his words was immense. It was to be their largest, most ambitious deception to date, a strategic lie on a grand scale. Their mission was to create the ghost of an entire army group, a massive force preparing for a major assault in a sector far from the true offensive. They were to convince the German High Command, to mislead their generals into shifting precious reserves, panzer divisions, and artillery, to face a threat made of painted canvas and recorded sound. The stakes were no longer a single battalion or a diverted artillery barrage. They were the success or failure of a pivotal campaign, and the lives of tens of thousands of men in the real attacking force hung in the balance. The briefing concluded without fanfare. The officers rolled up their maps, their final, lingering looks impressing upon the men the absolute, uncompromising secrecy and importance of what was to come. As they filed out of the barn back into the muted daylight, the men of the Ghost Army carried a new and heavier burden. They were no longer just creating phantoms. They were now architects of a strategic reality, their brushes and speakers tasked with bending the will of an entire enemy command structure. The familiar fields of France suddenly felt vast and exposed, the stage for a performance where a single missed note, a single unconvincing shadow, could echo with the sound of catastrophic failure. Landscape itself seemed to conspire in their deception, a series of low, wooded hills and mist-shrouded valleys perfectly suited for the birth of a phantom army. The move to the new location was executed under a cloak of oppressive secrecy, their convoy of unmarked trucks winding along back roads under a sky the color of tarnished lead. They arrived not at a bustling military camp, but at an area of deliberate emptiness, a stretch of land chosen for its visibility from the air and its potential for grand-scale theatricality. The air was cold and still, the silence broken only by the creak of the truck's springs and the low murmur of the officers pointing out the sectors for their illusory headquarters. A palpable tension settled over the men, a nervous energy that was sharper and more focused than before. Operation Bettendorf was not just another routine deception. It was a high-stakes gambit to fool an entire enemy command. The work began with a frantic, yet eerily silent, industry. From the trucks emerged not just the familiar bundles of tanks and trucks, but new, larger forms, giant, flattened packages that contained the components of an entire fake headquarters. There were inflatable barracks, warehouses, and even a command post, all designed to be assembled into a convincing military installation. Jack's role had expanded. He was no longer just the artist of individual vehicles. He was now the overseer of the entire visual tableau, the director of a grand illusion, meant to be viewed from the heavens. He moved through the chaotic scene, his eyes constantly scanning, assessing, his mind assembling the pieces, not as they were, but as they needed to appear on a German reconnaissance photograph. His team worked with a new intensity, their usual banter extinguished by the gravity of the task. The powerful air compressors hummed, their sound dampened by the surrounding woods, breathing life into the sprawling complex. Inflatable buildings swelled into existence there, canvas walls, taut and unnervingly perfect. Jack moved among them, a critical eye noting the flaws that believability demanded. The buildings were too clean, their lines too sharp. He directed his men to sag the rooflines slightly, to stake them unevenly so they looked settled into the earth, not just placed upon it. He had them scatter real debris crates, empty fuel drums, scraps of canvas around the perimeter, creating the lived-in clutter of an active base. He used charcoal to sketch in the shadows that would fall between the buildings at high noon, the time a reconnaissance plane was most likely to pass, ensuring the aerial perspective would show depth and dimension, not a flat, suspiciously neat model. The centerpiece of the visual deception was the motor pool, a vast array of inflatable trucks, jeeps, and staff cars arranged in precise, militarily logical rows. But Jack knew that logic could be its own enemy. From the air, perfection was a red flag. He had the men stagger the plea. Vehicles, leaving some with their canvas doors ajar, others slightly askew. He personally oversaw the weathering, directing the application of mud and dust, not uniformly, but in patterns that suggested recent travel and heavy use. He painted fake tire tracks leading in and out of the compound, weaving a narrative of constant activity. His mind was a constant calculation of angles and light, of how a shadow would fall, of how a patch of disturbed earth would read from 500 feet. It was a colossal exercise in forced perspective and environmental storytelling, where every detail from the placement of a dummy radio antenna to the scatter of fake paperwork near the command tent was a sentence in the lie they were telling. As dusk began to bleed into the horizon, turning the sky a deep, bruised purple, Jack climbed a small rise at the edge of their creation. He looked back at the sprawling complex they had built from nothing. In the fading light, It was breathtakingly convincing.
The fake headquarters hummed with a silent, manufactured purpose, a perfect replica of a command center, preparing for a major offensive. The tension that had driven them all day now coiled tighter.
This was no longer a practice field in Tennessee, or a small-scale diversion. This was Operation Bettendorf, a masterpiece of visual deception, laid like a trap for the German High Command.
The success of the real offensive, and the lives of thousands of men, now depended on the fragile, painted realism of their canvas world, a world that would be put to the ultimate test with the first light of dawn. As the last of the daylight bled from the sky, surrendering the phantom headquarters to the deep velvet of the night, a new layer of the deception began to awaken. While Jack's visual tableau stood in silent, convincing readiness, it was a hollow shell without the breath of life. That breath came from the sonic engineers, who now began their own meticulous performance.
From the back of a heavily modified truck, Mike and his team initiated the broadcast of carefully scripted radio traffic. The airwaves, usually a chaotic jumble of coded messages and terse commands, now carried the detailed, unencrypted chatter of a full Army group staff. Fake division commanders reported their readiness. Phantom supply officers lamented shortages of fuel and ammunition, and ESAT's intelligence operatives discussed the weaknesses in the enemy lines they were preparing to assault.
The voices, filtered to sound distant and slightly distorted, wove a complex narrative of imminent attack, a story told in whispers over the ether, designed to be intercepted by the eager ears of German signals intelligence. On the ground, the illusion was reinforced by a ballet of staged activity. Small teams of men, acting as dummy patrols, moved with deliberate purpose along the perimeter of the fake headquarters. Their movements were not the frantic scramble of real preparation, but the measured, visible patrols of a secure and confident force. They carried lanterns with their shutters cracked, creating pools of moving light that suggested a high level of alertness and organization. The crunch of their boots on the gravel, the occasional muffled cough, the clink of a canteen, these small human sounds provided the subtle, sub-audible proof to accompany the grand radio drama. They were the extras on this vast stage, their presence validating the story being told over the airwaves. To any hidden observer, the entire area pulsed with the authentic, bustling energy of a major command post on the eve of a great battle. The tension within the Ghost Army was a live wire, humming with a nervous energy that made sleep impossible. They moved through the night like ghosts in their own production, tending to their illusions, listening to the fabricated war unfolding around them. Jack patrolled the lines of inflatable buildings, his artist's eye searching for any flaw that might betray them in the morning.
Light a scene too straight, a shadow painted at the wrong angle, a dummy vehicle looking too pristine. He adjusted a net here, kicked dirt over a too-perfect track there, his every sense heightened. The success of the visual deception he had labored over now depended entirely on the believability of the sounds and the staged activity. It was the ultimate synthesis of their arts, a perfect marriage of sight and sound, designed to create an unshakable truth in the mind of the enemy. Dawn arrived as a slow gray seepage into the eastern sky, revealing their handiwork in the cold, clear light. The fake headquarters stood, seemingly impervious, a testament to their collective skill. Then, the confirmation they had been waiting for began to trickle in. Not with a fanfare, but through the crackling field radios monitored by the intelligence officers. The first reports were fragmented, but their meaning was unmistakable. German reconnaissance flights had indeed circled overhead at first light, their cameras capturing the convincing tableau below. More critically, the intercepted Enigma traffic told the real story. The German High Command was reacting. Orders were being issued, diverting a panzer division from its reserve position near the real Allied offensive. Artillery batteries were being repositioned. Infantry reserves were being marched on forced routes to counter the phantom threat of Operation Bettendorf. The ruse had not just been believed, it had been acted upon with decisive military conviction. A wave of quiet, disbelieving vindication washed through the unit. There were no cheers, only a collective exhalation of breath held for too long, and a series of slow, knowing nods between the men. Mike emerged from the sound truck, his face haggard but his eyes bright with a fierce pride. The distant, thunderous roar of artillery, now aimed at empty fields miles away, was the ultimate validation of their efforts. The German intelligence apparatus, so methodical and ever at, so methodical and feared, had fallen completely for their grand artistic lie. They had taken the painted canvas and amplified sounds and built a solid strategic reality around them, redirecting the flow of entire divisions based on a masterpiece of collective deception. The Ghost Army had not just created a phantom, they had, for a critical war-altering moment, commanded the enemy's army. The confirmation arrived not as a single triumphant bulletin, but as a slow, steady seepage of validated intelligence, each report a solid brick laid upon the foundation of their grand deception. The field radios, usually spitting static encoded fragments, now carried the clear, undeniable proof of their success. Aerial reconnaissance photographs, smuggled through intelligence channels, showed German panzer divisions, real, steel behemoth formations churning up roads miles from the true Allied offensive, slogging toward the empty fields where the Ghost Army's phantom headquarters had stood. Intercepted enemy communications crackled with frustrated orders, and redirected supply lines, all aimed at countering a threat that had never existed. The relief that washed through the unit was a physical force, loosening knotted shoulders and allowing genuine weary smiles to break through the grime and exhaustion on the men's faces. They had done it. They had painted a lie so convincing it had bent the strategic will of the German war machine, drawing its fangs away from the real attack and saving countless Allied lives in the process. A fierce, quiet pride bloomed in the cold air, a shared understanding that their bizarre and unorthodox war was as potent as any fought with rifles and bayonets. For Jack, however, the vindication was a distant island, visible across a churning sea of his own turmoil. He watched his comrades Mike clapping Henry on the back, David the set designer surveying their dismantled stage with a satisfied eye, and he felt a profound disconnect. The success was real. The lives saved were undeniably a cause for celebration, but his own sense of accomplishment was corroded by the psychological toll of their craft. He found a secluded spot away from the others, his back against the cold bark of an oak tree, and pulled out his sketchbook. The familiar leather cover was stained with mud and smeared with paint, a testament to the journey from his clean Brooklyn studio. He opened it, not to the pages filled with careful studies of French landscapes or his comrades' faces, but to a new, blank sheet. His charcoal stick, usually an instrument of precise observation, now moved with a frantic, jagged energy. He did not draw the triumphant scene around him. Instead, his hand slashed across the paper, creating a chaotic whirl of dark, overlapping lines. He sketched the ghost of a tank, but its form was twisted and half-formed, its painted shadows seeming to writhe and bleed into the paper. He drew the faces of German soldiers he had never seen, their features blurred and anxious, their eyes turned toward the empty fields, where their artillery was now uselessly falling. He sketched his own hand, the one that held the brush, but it was depicted as a skeletal thing, dripping not with paint, but with a thick, black substance that pooled at the bottom of the page. This was not the war of grand strategy and saved lives. This was the war inside his own mind, a landscape littered with the psychological shrapnel of their deceptions. The pride he felt for his unit was genuine, a warm ember in his chest, but it was smothered by the cold ash of a recurring thought. His greatest talent, the skill that defined his very soul, had been honed into a weapon of mass manipulation. He had used his understanding of light, form, and human perception not to create beauty or seek truth, but to craft a perfect, weaponized lie. Each convincing shadow he had painted on a rubber tank felt like a small betrayal of the artistic principles he held dear. He was a forger of reality, and the success of his forgeries left him feeling hollow, as if he had sold some essential part of himself to the war. The sketches in his lap were not pictures. They were screams rendered in charcoal, the unspeakable inner turmoil of an artist who had discovered that his gift could be as destructive as it was creative, and that the most perfect illusion he had ever created was the one of his own moral certainty. The nightmares did not arrive with the subtlety of whispers, but as violent, sensory assaults that ripped Jack from the thin veneer of sleep. They were not replays of close calls, or the remembered thunder of artillery, but grotesque perversions of his own craft. In one, he stood before an inflatable tank, his brush loaded with paint that, upon touching the canvas, dissolved the rubber into a fine, bloody mist. In another, the recorded sounds of Mike's phantom army twisted into the agonized screams of men caught in a barrage he himself had drawn down upon them. The most persistent vision was of a German reconnaissance pilot, his face clear and accusing in the cockpit, pointing directly at Jack as his painted shadows melted away, revealing the hollow, pathetic truth of their deception just before the real bombs fell. He would wake in a cold sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs, the lingering images seared onto the back of his eyelids, more vivid than any memory of the real war. The darkness of the tent felt suffocating, thick with the ghosts of his own creations. By day, a heavy fatigue clung to him, a leaden weight that made the simple act of lifting a brush feel Herculean. The vibrant energy of the unit, the focused buzz of creation that had once invigorated him, now felt like a distant hum from behind a pane of glass. He moved through his duties mechanically, painting the familiar shadows and mud spatters on the new batch of inflatables. But his heart was not in the work. The precision was gone, replaced by a rote, disconnected motion. His artist's eye, once his most trusted tool, now seemed to betray him. Seeing only the potential for catastrophic failure in every stroke, the fragility of their entire enterprise in every seam of the rubber tanks. The others noticed his silence, the hollow look in his eyes, but the unspoken code of soldiers kept their questions at bay, leaving him isolated in the crowded camp. The breaking point came during a routine camouflage exercise. His task was to blend a real ammunition truck into a copse of trees, a job he had performed with pride and skill before. But as he draped the netting, his hands began to shake. The familiar, earthy smell of the mud paste he was mixing suddenly seemed cloying, nauseating. He saw not a truck he was protecting, but a potential explosion waiting to happen. its discovery his fault because of some minute flaw in his work. He stumbled back from the vehicle, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. He mumbled an excuse about needing air and walked away from the bewildered stares of his team, his legs carrying him on an unsteady path away from the camp, into the relative quiet of a nearby wood. He found Mike there, sitting on a fallen log and meticulously cleaning a piece of sound equipment with a soft cloth. Mike didn't look up as Jack approached, his collapse onto the log beside him, loud in the stillness. For a long moment, the only sound was the methodical swipe of the cloth and Jack's ragged breathing. Then, the words tumbled out of Jack, a choked, disjointed confession. He spoke of the nightmares, the shaking hands, the crushing weight of knowing that their art, his art, was a trigger for real violence, that their success was measured in the diversion of death. He confessed the profound sense of corruption, that he had taken the beautiful, truthful language of art and twisted it into a weapon of lies. Mike listened, his work never ceasing, a calm anchor in the storm of Jack's anguish. When Jack finally fell silent, spent and hollow, Mike set the cleaned component aside and looked at him, his gaze steady and devoid of judgment. He spoke not of art, but of consequence. He reminded Jack of the intelligence reports that confirmed the diversions of entire German divisions. He painted a different picture with his words, not of the empty fields they shelled, but of the crowded roads and bridges where the real Allied forces advanced, unmolested, because the enemy was looking the other way. He spoke of the faces of the infantrymen they would never meet, men who made it home to their families because a painted shadow on a rubber tank had convinced a German general to make a catastrophic mistake. Their role, Mike said, his voice low and firm, was not to fight the war, but to unfight it, to create pockets of safety through misdirection, to save lives not by taking them, but by using creativity to make the enemy waste their fury on phantoms. It was a war of the mind, and their brushes and speakers were their rifles. Jack did not find an immediate miraculous peace in Mike's words, but they provided a lifeline, a different perspective to cling to in the churning sea of his doubt. Later that evening, instead of retreating into the torment of his own mind, he sought a different kind of solace. He built a small, shielded fire away from the tents and opened his sketchbook to a clean page. But this time, he did not reach for the charcoal to exorcise his demons. He picked up a pencil and began to draw Mike as he had seen him that afternoon, his hands caring for his equipment with a quiet reverence. He drew the focused calm on his friend's face, the strength in his posture. He sketched the trees around them, not as threatening shadows, but as silent, enduring witnesses. He drew the simple, honest lines of the log they had sat on. He was not creating a deception or documenting horror. He was seeking and finding a fragment of peace, a moment of human connection and steadfastness. The act of drawing, of using his skill to capture something real and good, felt like a homecoming. The lines were steady, his breath even. In the quiet act of creation, he was not a weapon or a forger. He was simply an artist again. And in that identity, he began to find the strength to carry the heavy, necessary burden of his war. The relentless grind of operations had worn them down to their raw, exposed nerves, the constant moves under cover of darkness, the sleepless nights spent breathing life into phantoms, the ever-present, gnawing fear of discovery. It all accumulated like a layer of grime that no amount of washing could remove. The initial thrill of their successful deceptions had faded, replaced by a bone-deep fatigue that made every task feel like wading through mud. The men of the Ghost Army moved through their duties with a hollow-eyed automatism. Their usual camaraderie stretched thin. The pressure cooker environment, once a crucible for innovation, was now a tinderbox for frustration. The spark came over something trivial. The allocation of the remaining stocks of a specific fast-drying paint that Jack needed for the intricate weathering on a new batch of inflatable howitzers. The supply sergeant, a pragmatic man named O'Malley, whose world was governed by ledgers and quotas, had earmarked the last cans for reinforcing the unit's real vehicles. Jack, his patience frayed to a single quivering thread, argued with a heat that surprised even himself. He gestured wildly at the half-painted decoys, his voice rising as he insisted that the visual realism of their phantoms was as vital as the engine of a truck. O'Malley stood his ground, his face a stoic mask, citing regulations and the very real need for their own transportation to not break down. The argument escalated, drawing a small crowd of tired, on-edge men. Harsh words were exchanged, not just about paint, but about priorities, about the value of their illusory work versus the tangible needs of the unit. It was a release of pent-up tension, a petty conflict that laid bare the profound strain they were all under. The disagreement ended not with a resolution, but with a frigid silence. The two men turning away from each other, the unspoken bond of the unit momentarily fractured. The sour mood lingered for hours, a pall of resentment that hung over the camp. Then, as dusk began to settle, Mike and David, the Broadway set designer, hatched a plan. It was born not from a place of discipline, but from a desperate need to lance the boil of collective frustration. They enlisted a few others, including a chastened but still simmering Jack, and set to work in a secluded corner of the encampment. Their project was a piece of pure, unadulterated folly. They took one of the smaller, spare, inflatable jeeps, but instead of painting it in standard olive drab, they gave it a garish, cartoonish makeover. With paint meant for marking landing zones, they gave it wide, googly eyes on the headlights, a lolling tongue on the grill, and a series of ridiculous, loopy unit insignia on the doors. They positioned it just outside O'Malley's supply tent, its ridiculous grin aimed directly at the entrance. The reaction was not immediate. When O'Malley first emerged and saw the absurd vehicle, he stopped dead, his face unreadable. For a long, tense moment, he simply stared. Then, a sound escaped him, a choked snort that quickly blossomed into a deep, rolling belly laugh that seemed to shake the fatigue from his broad shoulders. The laughter was infectious. It spread through the men who had gathered, a wave of cathartic release that washed away the bitterness of the afternoon. Jack found himself laughing too, the tight knot of anger in his chest, unraveling at the sight of the sergeant doubled over, tears of mirth in his eyes. The prank was a piece of meaningless, glorious nonsense, a reminder that beneath the uniforms and the grim purpose, they were still the same collection of artists and eccentrics who had bonded over shared strangeness back at Camp Forest. That night, gathered around a low-burning fire, the atmosphere was transformed. The shared laughter had acted as a reset. O'Malley passed around a precious, carefully hoarded bottle of brandy, and Jack offered no more arguments about paint. They talked not of war or deceptions, but of home, of the silly things they missed, of the lives they hoped to return to. They reaffirmed their bond not with grand speeches, but with this quiet, comfortable companionship. They were a team, a family of misfits, united by a secret so immense it could only be carried together. The fatigue was still there. The fear had not vanished, but it was now shared weight, distributed across their collective shoulders. The purpose of their strange war was renewed, not by a commanding officer's briefing, but by the simple, healing power of a shared joke. As the fire died down to embers, they sat in a contented silence, readying themselves not as individuals, but as a single entity, a ghost in the machine of war, prepared to face the next challenge with their creativity, their cunning, and their hard-won camaraderie intact. The maps spread across the makeshift table in the command tent were not mere charts of terrain. They were blueprints for a grand and perilous fiction. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp wool, stale coffee, and the sharp, electric scent of high-stakes tension. Officers from Supreme Headquarters stood shoulder to shoulder with the haggard commanders of the Ghost Army, their fingers tracing not the planned routes of real divisions, but the ghostly contours of an entire corps that existed only in their collective imagination. The objective was staggering in its audacity: to convince Hitler's generals that the main Allied thrust would come through the rugged, forested hills of the Ardennes, a quiet sector, thereby drawing the German reserves away from the true, concentrated offensive planned for the open plains to the north. Their fate of the coming campaign, and potentially the war itself, now hinged on the believability of their illusions. The Ghost Army was no longer a tactical diversion. It was a strategic weapon, and its trigger was the artistry of its men. The weight of this responsibility settled on Jack's shoulders with the crushing force of a physical blow. He was summoned from his usual duties and stood before the detailed planning maps, his artist's mind reeling at the scale of the deception. His task was not to design a few tanks or a fake headquarters, but to orchestrate the visual narrative for an entire phantom corps, thousands of vehicles, acres of supply dumps, and the intricate, lived-in detail of an army poised to strike. The pressure was a vice tightening around his temples. He was being asked to push his artistic talents beyond any limit he had ever known, to paint a lie so vast and so perfect it would hold up under the most intense scrutiny from the sky and from the enemy's most astute intelligence analysts. Every shadow he painted, every fake track he laid, had to whisper a single convincing truth to the German High Command: the main blow is coming here. For the next 48 hours, Jack's world shrank to the confines of a lantern-lit tent, the maps his only landscape. He worked in a feverish state of creation, his sketchbook filling not with graceful studies, but with frantic, detailed schematics. He designed decoy motor pools that mimicked the precise formations of real armored divisions, ensuring the spacing and alignment would appear authentic from aerial photographs. He plotted the placement of inflatable artillery batteries on reverse slopes, calculating the angles so their shadows would fall correctly at high noon. He sketched the patterns for fake vehicle parks, incorporating the subtle chaos of real military encampments, the scattered debris, the improvised latrines, the worn paths between tents. He pushed his understanding of perspective and light to its absolute limit, designing not just objects, but an entire environment, a sprawling, three-dimensional forgery of military might. His hand ached from the constant sketching, his eyes burned from the poor light, but he drove himself relentlessly, the specter of potential failure a more potent stimulant than any coffee. He was no longer just an artist. He was a cartographer of a phantom world, and the lines he drew on paper were the first, fragile threads of a deception that would need to be strong enough to bear the weight of the entire Western Front. The first light of dawn unveiled their masterpiece, a sprawling phantom core painted across the misty Ardennes landscape.
Inflatable tanks stood in perfect tactical formation along the tree lines, their shadows stretching long and convincing across the dew-kissed grass. Rows of rubber trucks crowded fake motor pools, while canvas command tents and supply dumps created the intricate infrastructure of an army preparing for battle.
Jack's visual deception was a symphony of manufactured reality, every detail meticulously crafted to withstand the scrutiny of German reconnaissance. As the sun climbed, the sonic illusion began.
Mike's speakers broadcast the layered sounds of armored columns moving into position, the distant rumble of bulldozers creating fake defensive works, and the dense radio traffic of multiple divisions coordinating a major assault. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the promise of an imminent offensive, a grand lie woven from light and sound, designed to echo all the way to Berlin.
The initial reports from intelligence were electric. German reconnaissance planes circled obsessively over their position, their cameras capturing the convincing tableau. Enigma intercepts confirmed the ruse was taking hold. Enemy command was nervously debating the threat, beginning to shift reconnaissance assets and artillery spotters to face the phantom core. A giddy, disbelieving hope began to bloom among the men. They had laid the trap, and the enemy was stepping into it. But in war, no plan survives. First contact intact.
As the afternoon wore on, a new, more immediate threat emerged. A report came from a forward observer, a German scout patrol. A handful of seasoned infantrymen had slipped through the lines and was moving with cautious precision directly toward the heart of their visual deception.
These were not distant observers, relying on cameras and radios. These were men on the ground, close enough to see the truth. A frozen silence fell over the unit. The air compressors were killed. The speakers fell mute mid-roar, leaving an unnerving void. Every man held his breath, becoming a statue among the statues they had created. From his position near a line of inflatable Shermans, Jack watched the patrol advance. They moved with the weary competence of veterans, their eyes scanning not the sky, but the ground, the trees, the tiny details that could betray an illusion. One of them, a sergeant with a sharp, hawk-like face, paused barely 50 yards from Jack's position. His gaze swept over the tank. Jack stood beside, and for a heart-stopping eternity, it lingered.
Jack could see the man's eyes trace the painted weld seams, the fake mud spatters, the carefully rendered shadow beneath the turret. He was an artist facing his most brutal critic, and the review was happening in real time, with life and death as the stakes.
The German's expression was unreadable, a mask of professional assessment. He took a step closer, his head tilting as if listening for the hum of a real engine. The smell of diesel. Jack's resolve, which had wavered under the psychological toll of their work, now solidified into a cold, hard diamond of focus. He did not move a muscle, his faith placed entirely in the quality of his own artistry. He remembered the countless hours in the Tennessee warehouse, the sergeant's stories of lives saved, the profound understanding that these painted shadows were a shield. He believed in the lie he had created. The German sergeant's eyes narrowed. He took one last, long look at the tank, then glanced at the others in the formation. Their staggered, imperfect placement, the believable clutter around them. He grunted something to his men, a dismissive shake of his head. They were looking at a clever dummy display, he seemed to conclude. A diversion meant to draw their attention from the real threat elsewhere. With a final sweeping glance, he signaled his patrol, and they melted back into the forest, leaving the phantom core untouched. The release of tension was a physical wave that left the men weak-kneed and trembling. They had not just fooled cameras and radios. They had fooled the sharp, suspicious eyes of frontline troops. The decoys, born from Jack's brush and the team's collective skill, had held firm under the most intimate scrutiny. As the scouts disappeared, a slow, fierce pride swelled through the unit, a silent acknowledgement of their mastery. The close core was not a failure, but the ultimate validation. Their artistry was not just convincing from a distance. It was robust enough, believable enough in its minute details to withstand a point-blank examination. The Ghost Army's masterstroke was no longer just a plan on a map. It was a living, breathing reality that had just passed its most dangerous test, cementing a success that would echo through the command bunkers of the Third Reich and change the course of the war. The silence that fell over Europe was not the quiet of peace, but the stunned, hollow stillness that follows the final crashing chord of a long and terrible symphony. The news of Germany's surrender arrived not with celebration, but with a profound, weary disbelief. For the men of the Ghost Army, the end of the war was as surreal as their part in it had been. There were no victory parades for them. No medals pinned to their chests in the glaring light of public acclaim. Their demobilization was as secret as their service had been. In a quiet corner of a mustering-out camp in France, they were gathered one last time, not by a commanding officer, but by the unspoken bond of their shared, impossible secret. The order was simple, final, and absolute. They were to return to their lives and never speak of what they had done. Their war was to be erased, their phantoms consigned to the silence of classified files, their legacy buried under the weight of official secrecy. The parting was a quiet, somber affair. Hands were shaken, backs were clapped, but the words were few. What could be said? They had shared an experience that defied explanation, a chapter of the war that would remain unwritten in the history books. Jack watched Mike heft his duffel bag, the sound man offering a final slow nod before turning toward a different future. Henry the sculptor and David the set designer disappeared into the crowd of returning soldiers, their unique talents now just memories of a strange and distant past. They melted away, these architects of illusion, leaving no trace of the grand deceptions that had saved thousands of lives. They were ghosts returning to the world of the living, their greatest performance remaining forever unseen and uncredited. The voyage home was a journey through a looking glass, back into a world that had moved on without him. The Brooklyn that welcomed Jack was both achingly familiar and irrevocably changed. The laundry lines and stickball games were still there, but the eyes of the people held a new depth, a shared knowledge of a darkness he had seen firsthand. He returned to his old apartment, the dust motes dancing in the same sunbeams, his half-finished sketches still on the easel as if waiting for his return. But the man who stood in that room was not the boy who had left. His hands, once stained only with charcoal and paint, now felt the phantom grit of French mud and the memory of cold, damp canvas. The war had etched itself onto him, not in visible scars, but in the quiet spaces behind his eyes. He unpacked his duffel bag slowly, his fingers finally closing on the worn leather cover of his sketchbook. He carried it to his desk, the weight of it feeling heavier than any weapon he had ever held. He opened it, and the story of the Ghost Army spilled out across the pages. It was not a story of battles won with bullets, but of wars averted with brushes and speakers. Here were the quick, gestural sketches of his comrade's Mike bent over his control panel, Henry's powerful hands shaping a decoy, David's critical eye surveying a stage set for war. Here were the inflatable tanks, rendered not as hollow jokes, but as the solemn painted shields they had been. He had drawn the French landscapes, the shattered villages, the weary faces of real soldiers, and the spectral, silent forms of their phantom armies standing guard over empty fields. These were not just drawings. They were a testament, a secret history. They were the only proof that a group of artists and engineers had once wielded their creativity as a weapon, that imagination had become a tool of survival. In the quiet of his studio, Jack reflected on the profound paradox of their war. Art, sound, and imagination, the very essence of human creativity. The forces that built cultures and expressed the soul had been forged into instruments of deception. They had used beauty to create ugliness,